Welcome everyone to Almost Cancelled. I am Peter and today I am going to be talking about Loki Season 1 Episode 4. It's called The Nexus Event. So full spoilers for the episode, as always. I was pretty down on last episode. I was very harsh in my critique, and coming into this one I wasn't really sure what to expect. I had a lot of concerns as to what it might do, and obviously I expected them to be saved off the planet very quickly, and indeed that did happen. But I definitely didn't predict a lot of the things that were going to take place throughout the rest of the episode. It kind of went in a lot of really weird, wacky directions. And it's very frustrating in a very different way to the previous episode. I actually think the last episode is even worse now in retrospect than it was at the time, because of what it failed to actually achieve. The big thing that really stuck out to me about this episode and what it revealed is that the reason why the TVA find them in the apocalypse, which up until now they can hide in apocalypses because everyone's going to die anyway. There's no actual variant things happening. There's no Nexus events. There's no nothing. But one happens anyway. Something somehow makes a Nexus event even without that, or even in those circumstances. And that turns out to be the spark of romance. The moment where the two Lokis touch and they share a moment, and that creates an extreme Nexus event, and the line coming off the timeline is so big and weird, and it's the weirdest thing they've ever seen. And that's what lets them know where they are, and that's why they come and get them. And then obviously this idea of Loki and Sylvie having an attraction, having some feelings for each other, is a little bit humorous, of course, because Loki's effectively found his perfect partner himself, and that's, there's a little bit of funny, stuff in there with that. But here's my problem with this. First of all, it makes me hate the last episode more because I don't think it succeeded in building any chemistry really between the two characters. I don't think it successfully built a mutual feeling between them. I don't buy the romantic element, and I think in theory it's a really cool idea that this caused this, that the idea of two variants like potentially forming something that's going to lead to a lot more things, because their interaction is going to create a new timeline of events, possibly offspring eventually, who knows. But I don't really buy anything. I didn't feel anything for them in the last episode. I went in depth as to why I didn't feel anything for them in the last episode, and why the horrible dialogue and exposition wasn't really there to make me feel anything for them. So because of that, I am now annoyed in retrospect, because the purpose of the last episode seems to be the idea of doing that. It seems to be the point of it was to build this relationship so that this would have weight. I also really question the choice of where to end the last episode. Why wouldn't you end with the moment? This moment at the start of the episode where they touch arms right before they think they're going to die, and this creates this Nexus event. Why wouldn't that be the end of the episode? Why wouldn't that be the end of episode 3? Why wouldn't that be the big climatic ending, is these feelings finally kind of having a spark that causes something? Again, I wasn't feeling it, and I still have all those critiques, but I don't understand why that wasn't your big ending of the last episode. The ending of last episode was nothing compared to this episode, which gives us like 3 huge cliffhangers or something like that is trying really hard to like really, I don't know, grab us and shock us and do wacky things. We get 2 shock deaths this episode, although the latter obviously proves not to be a complete death yet, meaning that probably Owen Wilson's also retrievable, but he does technically die in this episode. And I think what frustrates me about this episode is just how undercooked everything in this show now appears to be. I saw a lot of potential in the opening episode or 2, and I think this episode has shot us so far over the line into new territory that I feel like they wasted every single thing that was interesting about what they were doing before. If this was becoming a dystopian sci-fi story where all the people who work for the TVA are actually being controlled, they don't remember their real lives, compare it to any like dystopian sci-fi tale of a society that is being controlled, whether they're aware of it or not. That's kind of where this story was veering into. And if there was a slow build to that, that might have been fun, but we only have 6 episodes. It's kind of weird that in hindsight now, I'm almost critiquing this for rushing through things now. I mean, I suppose it's just down to good and bad writing, and it's not good. I guess that just is where we sum it up, but all the ideas are fine. There's nothing wrong with any of the ideas here. If anything, I would say that most of the ideas are pretty good. But how quickly Owen Wilson just completely flips in his own Loki side after one thing, you know, we get to this point where they want to have his big tragic sudden death. I feel like it has impact, and they have him, you know, be nice with Loki right before. Loki calls him a friend. It's a whole thing, and then he dies immediately. I felt so underwhelmed by this attempt at a shock death that I don't know, I was like, you've completely lost me. Over the last 2 episodes, you've lost me. And what's impressive is you've lost me in 2 completely different ways. So that, I think that's undercooked. I think the feeling, everything just feels kind of rushed, particularly with Owen Wilson. Also B-15, who is a character in this episode, because she was affected by Sylvie before. She's got this memory of something from her real life, and it's kind of like provoking her to act out and like seek answers and ultimately help Sylvie. And again, this all feels very rushed, and it feels like it just ends with a sort of mundane, dull fight in front of the timekeepers with a bit of sword fighting. And it's just typical TV nonsense, and none of it really feels like it matters. But yeah. All of these things are good ideas. The idea of one of the characters slowly being aware. The idea that the first person, you'll see 20, or what I say her name was, who has now been killed off screen because she was being vocal that she remembered her real life. And the idea of that cover-up. Like, this should be more of a slow brooding thing. And this episode just goes through so much plot that none of it resonates. All of it just feels like ideas been thrown at me so quickly. You know, the start of this episode to the end of this episode, we go from what they, you know, I mean, maybe not from the start of this episode. Technically, we dropped the idea of Sylvie as the villain last episode, but this episode, we have, by the end of it, the TVA are the villains. Gugu Mbatha is Ra's character. She becomes, like, one of the key villains in this episode. And again, some time to build that, some time to slowly build the menace of her and how evil she is, but none of it worked for me. I didn't buy any of it. It just felt like a TV actor. And that's not to critique her. I think she's actually a really great actress. San Junipero is phenomenal. Go watch that episode of Black Mirror. It's excellent. But her character here is so just suddenly being... And it's not that it wasn't teased a little bit. Like, I'm not saying it wasn't there at all, but we just go in one episode from this relationship between her and Owen Wilson, where there's this camaraderie, this respect. I don't know if it might be slightly romantic or not, but... And I know they've got the different age difference, but their ages are actually kind of irrelevant here because of the weird, you know, they're both not aging in this world, so they've both been alive for a long ass time. Whatever, but we have that relationship break down to the point where she just kills him with a snap of her fingers, and then is the one monologuing and being evil with Sylvie and saying, I don't even remember what the Nexus event was that meant you had to be brought in. And that's one of the things that kind of led me down this path, more so the dystopia thing, along with everything else. But the idea that Sylvie was taken as a child, and she doesn't even know what the Nexus event was. It wasn't like Loki, who did kind of intentionally do something to try and escape his fate. And even if he didn't know that he was breaking the timeline, because, you know, okay, he knew the time traveled, he revealed that he figured that out, but ultimately he doesn't know this is not what's meant to happen. But for a kid like her, and, you know, going back to the kid from the first episode that Owen Wilson sees, they don't know their variants. They didn't decide this. And it feeds into other science fiction. You know, typically when you have dystopia, you'll have members of society, whether it be based on race, age, sex, whatever it may be, sexuality even. You'll have people, you know, a part of society be used for something or be disregarded. And you explore a lot of social themes in science fiction with that. And this idea that all these variants that are working at the TVA, and all the ones who are killed as well, all don't really intentionally do anything that leads them there. It's all just something that happens without their control, and it's not their fault. They're essentially accidents. So why don't they deserve to live? Why don't the variants deserve to live somewhere? Because ultimately they didn't do this, for the most part. Maybe some did intentionally, but for the most part, they're just bystanders to something happening. It's not their fault. And that is a really interesting idea. I really wish it spent more time exploring that and spent more time talking about that idea. But it doesn't. It doesn't do really much with it all in, other than just make you feel a bit of sympathy for Sylvie because she was taken as a kid without much reason. But yeah, and this is the funny thing, is that it couldn't even let us go an episode thinking that Loki was gone. We got our first mid-credit scene this week where Loki wakes up and it teases all these other Lokis. Richard Grant's there as Old Man Loki. There's was it Crocodile Loki or whatever? There's a kid, and the other dude who looked like he was holding a version of Mjolnir. Didn't look like the movie Mjolnir, but it looked like a version of Mjolnir. So maybe that's the thing we're going to do. I mean, these are all probably from the comics. These are all probably things that people recognize, which was fine. But they couldn't even let us think that, oh, maybe they just passed the torch. Maybe the big shock of the show is that they're actually passing the torch to Sylvie, and now Sylvie's the main character. Because, you know, the ending before that kind of almost feels like it might be going down that route. Admittedly, I still think the shock death was a bit weak, because nothing feels exciting enough to really justify the big payoffs that they're kind of pretending to have. And again, are they actually going to have these payoffs? I don't think so. I don't think so. That's, again, it's baffling to me. It's so funny to me that last week's my complaints were all just solid writing complaints, because the episode was doing really generic things, and there's still some generic things. Like I say, the fight towards the end just feels like a cheap fight on a set. There's nothing exciting about it. There's no momentum to it. It's just typical fighting, and I don't think Loki with a sword in sort of equal combat is what I think of when I think of a character like Loki and how he messes with people and how he fights his battles. And yeah, so but this episode just goes through so many ideas, and there's so much potential in everything. There's nothing wrong with a single idea, really, in this episode or in this show up until this point. But between just poor execution, which is basically all of it is pure execution, but between rushing through so much of it, like, we're going into a new thing. The end of the episode reveals that the timekeepers are just robots, and they didn't really create the TVA. So who's actually behind it? We're going into like a whole new territory of like mystery and what's going on now. But I don't really feel like we explored the idea of chasing an evil Loki. You know, when Loki was chasing Sylvie and we didn't know who she was, the mystery of who that was, I think, wrapped up too quickly. I think the romance that was supposed to be set up between them feels a bit forced and flat, with one notable exception. There's one detail in this episode I really quite like, because it actually is the payoff to something I already liked. Back in episode 2, I praised the Loki clearly looking up his mother in Asgard and caring about it, but then when Owen Wilson asked, he shrugged it off and pretended not to care. And I praised that because it was a simple two-step thing that told us so much about Loki and how he feels. So in this episode, when Owen Wilson bluffs that Sylvie's already been killed and she's gone, and he kind of goes, oh well, you know, good riddance, or whatever he says, you know, he tries to play it off. It's actually a really good payoff to that. It's a really good payoff to that. I talk about this all the time in TV, but you have this thing called shorthand, right? Shorthand, where this time we didn't have to have the setup. Although we kind of did, in the sense that we saw that they cared about each other. They had that moment. But we didn't necessarily need to have a direct setup for it. This time, when he lies and pretends he doesn't care, we've already established that that's a part of his character and how it's played with it in this show. So that moment had some meaning. That moment convinced me that he actually cared about her romantically more than the actual, you know, arms touching, looking at each other itself. This actually resonated a little bit, because it was one of the few things in this episode that I think was set up properly, it's kind of the rule of threes almost, because in the first, the episode 2, you have the setup, you have the payoff, but then you have the second payoff, which is the third step, the rule of threes, in this episode. And because the character in this case is alive, because before it was Asgard and his mother, they're dead, they're gone, but because here there's still something to fight for, there's still this person that he cares about to fight for, this had way much more weight. This was the one thing that kind of really worked for me in this episode, was this moment. And Owen Wilson kind of calling him out and saying, "Oh, you're such a liar, you clearly care about her," felt justified, because we, the audience, also know that. Because they'd clearly set it up, they'd shown us how he lies about this before, we recognise it here, so when Owen Wilson, after, a bit of pretend, starts laughing and says, "You clearly care about her," we side with Owen Wilson. He's a conduit for us, the audience, in this scene. And that actually works. That works. And I'll praise that one element. Everything else in this episode, pretty much, just feels like it's just firing through ideas so quickly that nothing has a chance to feel as impactful or as important as it should. Because they're all good ideas. The idea of one of the agents remembering her previous life and starting to question that. But that's the same episode as Owen Wilson doing the same thing. And Owen Wilson goes to Loki and says, "Okay, we have to do something about this. I'm on your side now. I believe you." Begrudgingly, but I'm kind of on your side. And I'll accept that the reason why, as soon as they get evidence and they start to remember something, the reason why it's so powerful is because it is a real memory, and it sort of clings to them, and they feel it in their gut in a way that they maybe wouldn't if it was just a piece of information about something else. But we actually have this character, this rogue now Hunter B-15 helping Sylvie, the very same episode that Owen Wilson is going through the same thing and has a shock death. Why isn't there an agent trying to help them for longer? Why wasn't one of these set up before? B-15 may be the better example. Again, the show is just rushing through too much, and as a result, I can't get excited about, someone finding out about the secret. Gugu Mbatha-Raw's character finds out that Owen Wilson's effectively turned on her in one scene. Relative to them being together on screen. They're together when he steals her fancy smartphone thing, and then the very next time we see her, she's already caught him, and it's time to kill you. There's no build up to it, there's no anticipation of what's going to happen when she finds out that he's working with Loki, or that he's completely changed his beliefs. There's no anticipation of I don't know, everything just feels like fluff. It feels like we're just going boom, 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 lots of ideas. We're churning this out as quickly as possible. We don't have time to actually explore any of these things and make them have any weight. So, yes, I am gobsmackingly disappointed with this episode, and the tease of all these other Lokis at the end doesn't do anything for me really, because ultimately at this point I've lost hope in caring about the show. And you'll notice I've not mentioned the big cameo yet. The Lady Sif, Loki's put in a sort of time loop prison cell where she comes in and punches him and knees him in the balls over and over again. And I've not mentioned that yet because it's slightly cute, I guess, to see Lady Sif again, but I think I kind of rolled my eyes a little bit because I could sense, and I've not looked at Twitter, I've not seen what people are saying about this episode, but I immediately tweeted that people are going to praise this episode because of the meaningless cameo. And it is a meaningless cameo. It really is. The only thing that remotely makes it relevant is the idea that what she says is that, you'll always be alone, and that maybe very thinly ties into the fact that he's maybe actually found someone. Or the weird kind of ironic twist on it where he is going to be alone because Sylvie's technically still him in a weird way. But that's it. It's a cheap pop. This is, I think part of the problem with the MCU is it's become so focused on, will someone show up? Will someone from another movie show up? Or will someone from, I don't know. It's, I'm definitely feeling cynical on that side of things, and I felt cynical during this scene. And it's not necessarily that this has to be a bad thing. Like, if the rest of the episode was good, if the rest of the show was good, and I was really into the writing, and everything was resonating with all these ideas, because these are all ideas I love, right? Typically in science fiction. They're all great ideas. Is that this would just be a cute little thing on its own, and I'd go, ah, that's nice. Feel to see her again, and whatever. This would be like the, if you go back to episode 1, my reaction to this scene, this prison cell where she's like popping in on a loop and hitting him, this would probably get the same reaction out of me, more or less, as the DB Cooper scene from the first episode. Because at that point, the show hadn't revealed that it was going to flounder its ideas yet. And at that point, I was still optimistic, I was still hopeful, it was doing things with Loki that were fine, and entertaining, yeah, they had his charisma and all the rest of it. But, you know, and that scene was just a kind of a fun little example of a bit of Loki's past. It doesn't necessarily have like a huge, big, important meaning, but it was a fun sequence, it was a cool idea, and it was entertaining. This scene would have probably garnered the same response from me, had I not been just feeling like everything else was kind of wasting my time in a weird way. There's a really worrying trend with these shows now that they can't actually maintain. WandaVision, shockingly, has remained the best one. I was definitely convinced in episode 1 of this that this could end up being the best one. But both this and Falcon and Winter Soldier have nosedived considerably in the middle of the season, and a lot of their flaws have really come out at that point in the show. And Falcon and Winter Soldier didn't even start that high up. Like I wasn't that in love with episode 1 of that. It was just okay, but like it really went downhill and had a pretty decent ending for the most part. There was a lot of things to like towards the end of the show, but it didn't really make up for the dull experience that it overall was. And this is frustrating because it's hitting on so many things that could be great, but it's just rushing past them and not really letting any of it resonate. This is something that could easily be twice as many episodes, assuming the writing was better. Obviously, if the writing was just as slapdash as the last episode was, for example, where it was just, you know, get to arbitrary point on map to escape, and the exposition was just, you know, questions being asked with no real new information being brought out, then yeah, obviously it would just be even more annoying because it'd be 12 episodes of that. But in theory, this could benefit from actually exploring all the ideas it's setting up, and I just don't feel like it's doing it. And I don't really feel like I've got anything else to say except repeat that point over and over again, because that's all I could feel during this episode. So there you go. That's my review of episode 4 of Loki. Oh, there's only 2 left. That was my feeling at the end of this. There's only 2 left at least. It's a shame. It's a shame. Let me know what you thought of the episode in the comments below. You can like and subscribe. All that stuff. Get us on the Twitters at mail_fuzz for channel updates, or myself at Wibble89. You can, of course, go to patreon.com/mailfuzztv for as little as $1 per month. You can support us over there and get some bonuses and all that sort of stuff. It helps keep all the content coming. And, of course, clicking those buttons on YouTube are really important. So, otherwise, that is me. Thank you once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?